Understanding afterlife communications, a scientific and personal view. And I will say there's a lot of science in here because I have a particular viewpoint. I've been studying the bridge between universal spirituality, metaphysics, the paranormal, and the quantum world for over 12 years. And I'm here to share some of that information with you. What I want to cover is this. I believe everything emanates from the consciousness of the Creator or the mind of God. There's many names for it, which expresses itself through light and sound in this world. That's how we can know it. What I want to do is introduce to you an idea, a scientific view from my point of view, and that is synchronization, the matching of quantum vibratory resonance. What I mean by that is that those from the other side of life are giving us messages or signals. It's up to us to receive them, but we have to be prepared for this. So we need to prepare ourselves by getting in resonance with it. Sometimes this happens naturally, other times we have to work at it. In addition to this, I want to cover some information about afterlife dimensions. These are aspects of conscious awareness in this world and beyond. And you can categorize some of these. Others have tried to do this. There are types of afterlife communications. I would like to correlate all of these together. My recent personal experiences of communication with my departed husband, correlate them with afterlife dimensions, with my scientific viewpoint, and with consciousness as light and sound. After that, if we have time, I'm going to go into some methods of afterlife communication that we can hone in on, we can emulate, we can try and prepare ourselves for that kind of communication in all kinds of ways, not just with afterlife entities, but through other paranormal kinds of communications as well. These involve our thoughts, words, feelings, and actions, which are all information that is expressed through dreams, lucid dreaming, contemplation, meditation, light and sound techniques, and we can access through hypnosis, regression, and sometimes through soul travel. Now, first, I want to say a few words about the situation today, because many people do not hold my viewpoint. I am in the consciousness camp that the God force is exhibited by consciousness alone. It does not emanate from the physical. It is expressed through the physical. So there has been a long-standing disagreement between physicists and people in the hard sciences and those who are studying spirituality, philosophy, metaphysics, the paranormal, and the like. And it seems like never the twain shall meet. But I think that there is a way to do that. But first of all, one has to recognize that in physics, in the world we live in, which is very materialistic and reductionistic, that science requires of us experimentation and verification. And you can't do that necessarily with subtle electromagnetic energies that are the form of communication. So how to do this? Well, it's expressed through light and sound, I believe. There are a few who adhere to the consciousness unifying theories. One of the best was David Bohm. He was a physicist as well. He introduced the idea of the hollow movement. And what this entails basically is that there's a structure implicit in the way life is and these dimensions of consciousness, and that we can interact with that. In other words, we receive information from the other side, and then we can also send information. It's a two-way street. This I have come to call the information highway. And in addition to this, I'd like to say something about energy. Consciousness, of course, another way of putting it is that it is energy. And we're talking about particles and waves. I'll get to that in a moment. I'd like to give you a quote from the famous Nikola Tesla, the famous engineer and inventor who has actually revolutionized our whole Western way of life, our global way of life for that matter. And he did say, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And indeed, I think he was quite right, although he wasn't focusing so much on the quantum world, which is what I intend to do, but everything I think is vibration. He came up with something called a resonance theory and proposed an electromagnetic view unifying the material and spiritual origins of the universe through something he called luminiferous ether, which united everything in an undifferentiated field of time, space, and energy, and at all physical levels. And he thought that this could also bridge different dimensions or multi-realities. He further felt that matter is concentrated light, and its formation resulted from resonant processes propagated by the interaction of wave structures. I believe this is partly right. I particularly adhere to his ideas about resonant waves. And so here we have something. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Is it a particle as we come to know it, like the atom, or is it a wave? And the answer is it is both. It is always a wave, but when we focus on it, when we participate in observing it, it becomes the particles of life that we are so familiar with. So here are some of the scientific assumptions that I'm making. It's just a few of them, probably not all. But I want to say that everything is energy, vibration, and consciousness. And this consciousness we know as the God force. I prefer to call it innate intelligence. And it is in a dynamic resonance of expression, similar to what Tesla first proposed, though I think he was looking at it strictly from a physical point of view. This resonance, wave resonance, is encoded information carried by light. I've already stated, it is what we call the collective unconscious, the mind of God, the matrix, the reservoir, the God force, or just the force. Many names are there. And I want to say that we are entangled with this information highway, just as David Bohm suggested. We can tune our focus and brave waves into what is called a signal line by harmonizing wavelengths. In other words, we're communicating via waves, subtle as they are and undefinable as they presently are by our current technology. I would say there are different kinds of information that are accessible from many different states of consciousness, which, of course, is also waves of a subtle nature. And so I'm introducing the idea, the principle of brainwave synchronization. Some people will call this phase coherence, where we're in sync with the message being sent and the message being delivered, or we are compatible. They're in sync, so to speak. In this world of ours, this is a depiction of the electromagnetic field as we've come to know it. And this little space right in here, this is where our spectrum of light is, how we perceive things. It's a very narrow band. It's about 4, maybe 5% of all there is. And you can see here that there are waves. There are radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves, and so on. When we're tuning into our media, we're amplifying these low frequency waves. On the other side, where I think some of the subtle wave structures are, the messages that we receive, well, it really kind of goes up exponentially here from ultraviolet, X-ray to gamma rays, and beyond this into cosmic waves. And we don't know how far out that goes. We can only measure as far as what is called the Planck constant, which is 10 to the 31st. And so we don't know what's out there. We can't measure it with our instruments. So we tend to ignore what's there. But this is where I think the communication may be happening for us. The light now is measured in wavelengths in angstroms, and sound is measured in hertz. So there's, a disconnect there of sorts, but I think we can look at this in terms of octaves, which I will explain to you. And just to give you an idea of how this works, an octave of visible light is 40 octaves up from the middle audio octave and 46 octaves up from the alpha brain waves. Okay, so let me explain to you what these octaves are, how they work. An octave is an interval of 8 pitches on a musical scale, if you are familiar with music at all. And so an octave is measured 2 to 1 here. So if you have a middle C note, which is 440 hertz, an octave above it is twice that. So it's 880, and the one below it, which is here, and then here's another, and here's another, if you are reading me. This is how it is measured, and I think these waves can be measured in octaves, which is a different scale than the one we normally use. Just to give you an idea of the scale of this, there are 7,200 octaves beyond the human range that we can measure theoretically or mathematically or otherwise. And then how many more are there? Is a good question. I don't know. This information highway, though, as it emanates from nothing at all that we can know, the unknowable, the anami, it emanates light and sound, like I said before, via what is called strings. I think these are light strings, and string theory, which has been popular in the past, I think comes the closest to it. And we are all connected this way. So as some people have suggested, things emanate from a singularity, the unconditional love, the God force, and they exhibit as light and sound. They go through a process which I have been studying and intend to write articles and maybe a book on this. It eventually becomes dark energy, and that interacts with dark matter to begin to create through a process plasma, which is the fourth state of matter, and then into matter as we know it with liquid, solids, air, and so forth. Now, in science today, our people, our physicists, really don't know what dark energy and dark matter are, but they're working on it. And hopefully, our new instrumentation, the James Webb Telescope, which they hope to launch soon, if it hasn't been already, we hope to learn a lot more about these processes and how they work. And hopefully within the next decade, we'll get a better handle on that. You see, these energies are so subtle, so beyond our ability to know them with their present technology. It's no wonder that there's been a disconnect between what I see as a continuum of from the God force creating life as we know it in the physical. This information highway is like radio transmissions with signals within these light strings and so forth. The question is, in afterlife communication, what bandwidth is being sent and what is being received? There's a scientific basis for this. I'm going to focus on intention and resonance. As I said before, I believe in synchronous vibration or resonance as the key here to our information exchange through harmonic octave scales. In other words, one scale is very similar to the next scale. It's just revved down in frequency, but the frequency pattern is the same. One of the things in science that helps us understand this is called the principle of entanglement or superposition. What does that mean? Einstein used to call this spooky action at a distance, but we know a lot more about it today. There is an electrical resonance between two or more particles at a distance that occurs when they're in harmony, they're in sync, they're in synchronization. Now, if you take time and space out of it, which would be fourth dimensional, see, they're just talking about the physical part of this in our world as we know it. Beyond that, I think it's instantaneous myself. One of the persons that helped me understand this was physicist Claude Swanson. He had a model called synchronized universe, which he thought was the key, and that quantum mechanics was going to help us do this. It was the interaction of particles across great distances in times. Again, talking about the physical, but I think we can transfer this into the quantum. And I will go on. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the key that I want to tell you about is some of these wave configurations come in sync, and they form layers, so to speak. They form phases, they form structures, which we could call dimensions, okay? So the key to psi phenomena and subtle energy is the synchronization of these vibrations, which we also call phase coherence, which can provide us with access to these other dimensions and realms. I'm going to talk about this further. In here, he depicts the whole idea of this in layers, so to speak, but this is so we can grasp it visually, when in fact, I think they're all existing simultaneously. But he does say that these sheets corresponding to stable universes or dimensions, they can bring knowledge or energy from other dimensions. And this is what's happening, I think, with afterlife communication. So now I want to talk a little bit about this, afterlife dimensions and communications. I am going to return to our screen here. And I would just like to say to you that whoever is listening to this live or in a recording, that this is my worldview that I am sharing based on a lifetime of inquiry and your learning, and what I have concluded from it because of my studies and my interest in bridging science and spirituality. And I don't mean to offend anyone's belief system. If you're happy where you are, if you have hope and you have joy and you have confidence and faith, then my idea is to stay where you are. If you're curious, you might investigate some of these ideas for yourself to see if they resonate with you. So I do want to be very clear about that. So I'm going to return to the screen here and go on with it and say, many are the depictions of what heaven looks like. Where does this information come from? It comes from our own experiences, maybe a near-death experience or a spiritually transformative experience. It may come from literature, from our social groups, our conventional religions, from our other spiritual paths. It may come from individuals who have reported what they saw, or authors. One person that comes to mind is Saint Teresa of Avila, who was a mystic. It can come from yogis and gurus and those who have dared to explore. And I call these explorers adventurers of the far country. When you put it all together, what I'm going to present to you here is my best version of how that works. It's not to say that this is the end all. You know, this is just my version as I've come to know it right now. I want to tell you, and this is a quote by someone even I hadn't heard of, but I liked it a lot because it says exactly what I want to say. There is no way to define a reality that is independent of the way we choose to look at it. We're choosing to look at that from our state of consciousness, what we have learned, what we have absorbed in our lifetimes. Here is a depiction of that in layers, as Dr. Swanson suggested. And let me take a look at the time here. Okay, we start with the physical, the astral, emotional, the causal, the mental, the etheric, and the soul plane. All of these states of conscious awareness exist within us already. And one thing I want to point out to you, I mean, there are ways of identifying, like a kind of a roadmap, where you are, where your experience is, in your dream state, in a vision, or what have you. As we go up here, there is increasing frequency and energy the higher we go, just like if you went from the physical into the cosmic rays. And on the other hand, there's increasing energy density. The more we go into the physical world, the denser it becomes. This is important to know because your experiences as a soul will be only of light and sound. And there will be an increase in form, starting with something etherical, and then gradually going on down into the physical density. Here are a few observations that I'd like to make before I go into each of these planes and explain them. Our consciousness already has these aspects, as I said before. It's a question of realizing them, becoming aware of them in self-realization and God realization. And I want you to know that we can communicate beyond the veil into these with some discipline and practice if you choose to. I mean, you make yourself into a greater state of happiness, perhaps by prayer or some other method that you have learned. And one can have multiple movements of awarenesses in any spiritual experience. I discovered that when I was trying to analyze some of the experiences I had with my departed husband, Lindsay, because it was hard for me to categorize where they are. And I really wanted to do that. But I saw that I was going from maybe one level to another level in the same experience. And I want to point out too, that everyone has their own dream and vision symbols. Now you can go to places like the archetypes of Jungian psychology, and you can take a look at those. And there are some universal ones that people can rely on, but basically everyone has their own symbols. I kept a journal, a diary of all of my experiences to preserve them. And I think that's important for anyone who has a departed person that they would like to communicate with or are already in the process of doing that. Because you will notice that there are discerning patterns, and you can discern a deeper meaning from these if you will keep a record of them. I think these communications tend to seek the greatest level of resonant coherence as I try to explain this to you. I noticed that in some of my experience, I tried to telepathically communicate with him, and it wasn't coming across. It wasn't coming across until I spoke aloud. This is because of where the entity is speaking from at their level of coherence, and then yours. It would be easier to hear something from the lower level than to jump up to a more mental telepathic level, if you follow me. And then finally, I just want to reiterate one more time, some of these experiences can be fearful unless you understand them, but just remember that fear, as an acronym, is false evidence appearing real. I, in this analysis, have drawn on a couple of references that I'd like to point out to you that helped me to understand my experiences with my deceased husband, and also to categorize them in order to fit them into a schema that I've been developing that tells us where our conscious awareness is. One of these is by Ward E. Barkefer Jr., called Secrets of Life After Death. And this is a man who, after 38 years, lost his wife. They were very close, and she began communicating with him telepathically. And he reciprocated, and they began to have conversations, which he recorded. Then he began asking questions of her about the afterlife, and her answers, which he recorded. And I found them very helpful in discerning what was happening to me. He has written 3 books: Beyond the Veil to Heaven, Beyond Earth Through Heaven's Gates, and Conversations from Heaven. And then a second set of books that was very helpful is by Roberta Grimes, who is well known in this IANDS group. Particularly the one, The Fun of Staying in Touch, was very good. Now, she, as a researcher, has provided lots of reference books and has analyzed a great deal of information. And the thing that I liked about this, which I could correlate with the different, what I call dimensions of consciousness, and my experiences, where she outlines different kinds of experiences: physical expressions, electricity, sense, sounds, thoughts, even numbers, dreams, synchronicities, or coincidences, and light, visions, and other kinds of manifestations that may be of a little higher nature. One of these, which I'd like to point out, is via soul travel. I'll give you some examples of that. So, what are these dimensions, and how can we relate to these? What are some examples of what these are like? Well, we can start with what we already know about our own physical plane. This is like a schoolhouse where we're learning unconditional love gradually, slowly, but surely, I think. And this is, as we have called it, the plane of illusion, time, space, matter, and the 5 passions. So what are those passions? Anger, greed, attachment, lust, and vanity in one form or another. And we're here to go beyond that, go beyond the lower nature into our higher mind and beyond. And that's where we start. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the other planes and where our departed relatives and friends, where they may be communicating with us, where, and beyond that, where we may be experiencing near death, or we may be experiencing spiritually transformative experiences as well. So these I'd like to correlate as best that I can with the dimensions that I have pointed out to you, and also with those descriptions of Mr. Barkefer and Ms. Grimes and their books that I've just told you about. Now, the first thing that I have here is knocks, lights, doorbells, and the like. I mean, this is more or less emanating from the astral plane, which you cannot see here because of this. I don't know if I could, oh, maybe I can raise that up. That would be good. Excuse me. So I had numerous experiences with this in a period that ranged from about a week after Lindsay, my partner, died, until about the end of the year. And then there were some other experiences in 2021 as well. So I had my share of taps and knocks on the door, especially my bedroom wall, knocks right near my head while I was sleeping, phones ringing when I had turned off my phone, and a combination of the above. So this was pretty typical. Now, this photo here reminds me of an experience some friends of mine who were very close with Lindsay as well, that they had. And she and her husband were walking after supper in the dark down a neighborhood street, and the street lights were on. As they passed, the street light went out, like right, it just winked out. And she said, well, it must be Lindsay. And so they laughed and walked on. 15 minutes later, they came back the same route, approaching the same winked out street light. And the man said, well, Lindsay, if it's you, well, turn it back on. And it did. Now, what's the chances of that actually happening? Perhaps not many. I mean, was it they doing it, or was it Lindsay doing it? Because they were thinking heavily about him, they said, when they were taking their walk, and they were feeling very sad. Now, the next thing we have here, which is still on the astral plane, are other kinds of experiences. And by the way, if you hear an inner sound of the roar of the sea, this is typically the astral plane, is the plane of emotions that you're having in the dream state, for example, or otherwise. I mean, there's a reason why many people choose to go to the seashore for relaxation and recreation, to get away from the busy world and soothe their emotions, hence the roar of the sea in this dimension. I would like to relay to you a story from one of Lindsay's nieces. Now, she had this experience before she knew that he had passed on. She did know he was sick and in the hospital. And she said, by the way, she's also a psychic herself. In this dream sequence, she saw Lindsay floating around, kind of like this, in what she described as a golden light sparkly body. Okay. And she noted that he was dancing around for joy, and he said, wow, what a cool body I have. And then she started talking with him and telling him that, well, Lindsay, as she was starting to wake up, but still in the dream state, talking with him, she said, well, you've just passed on a beautiful sunny day in Phoenix, Arizona. And then at that point, she woke up and realized that she had been dreaming. Next, she and her mother spoke on the phone, and that's when she found out Lindsay had already passed. I'd like to point out this is a typical astral body. It is always connected to the physical body by a silver cord. And when you're in the astral body here, if you have that experience or are observing it, you're always tied in with your emotions. So if you're having problems with emotional issues, you may be having a little rougher time, such as those who take drugs and have a far out experience, but they're carrying along with them all of their emotions. So that's just a caution that I mentioned to you. Also, pardon me, on the astral plane, there can be a lot of physical touching. I experienced this, and I believe that was also experienced by Ward Barkefer. Now in this, I had, like this photo that I found, I personally experienced taps on the forehead, soothing gestures on my forearm, on my hands, and occasionally when I was lying on my side, I would have a gentle nudging of my hip back and forth. And once I felt a real hard tapping on my forehead and then on the wall. That's when I realized that telepathically speaking with Lindsay was not working. And so that's when I started talking aloud. It was difficult when you're awakened from a very deep sleep, but that's what I decided was the best way to handle it. One of the most dramatic, well, first let me talk about hearing voices. I also, a couple of times, heard a voice, which I thought was him, speaking very close to my ear. But because I wear earplugs, because I'm sensitive to noises in the room, I couldn't make it out. So that didn't work very well and was abandoned. But my verification that these experiences were not some wandering entity, a poltergeist, but was Lindsay, was when they were happening. And this happened periodically to me. You see, Lindsay had colon cancer and had gone through chemotherapy. And while he was going through this therapy, we decided it was best if he had his own bedroom so he could come and go to the restroom as often as he needed to without disturbing me. But in the morning, when he felt like he could go to work, which is most of the time, but not all of the time, he would come into the room and he would gently take my right foot and he would swing it back and forth in a gentle waking up. And that is so very personal between the two of us. I knew that it was he. It was he who was shaking me awake. This happened sometimes in the middle of the night, and that's because it's electronically quieter. People are asleep. You know, they're not in their alpha beta brain waves, and there's not much traffic outside. But sometimes it happened exactly at the time when he would wake me up in the morning, which I thought was interesting. Now a word or two about the astral, or the causal plane. Now the causal plane is kind of difficult to describe. It's really of the place of memories where you can explore karmic patterns, past life records, and so on and so forth. So I have these pictures here, including an interesting book that I've read recently called Return to Life by Jim Tucker. I believe he has also been maybe a presenter at IANDS some time ago. But anyway, I had a few dreams with Lindsay. I mean, how do you depict this? It's past lives. So let me give you a couple of examples that I recorded. In one, we were both in a reed boat that had a hole in it. Now, these are the kinds of conveyances that are very, very ancient, very archaic. It reminded me immediately of Egypt, where they had reed boats on the Nile River. And in there, Lindsay kept looking at me in a strange kind of a way. And I got that feeling he felt stranded in the water. How I interpreted that, because water is such an astral and emotional a symbol, I got that he felt like he was stuck in his emotional bond with me because we were very, very close. He was the real deal for me, you know? Now that was one example. Then another one happened when we had a celebration of life for Lindsay. I was in Phoenix, Arizona. I had a host who was his very best friend, and I stayed with him when we had these meetings together. And it was during a very hot period, 118 degrees outside. And so guess what? We were at the swimming pool cooling off, and we were hanging on the edge of the pool together, this man and I, my host. His name was Julian. And all of a sudden, we were thinking and talking about Lindsay. It was our time to do that together. And all of a sudden, I see him in a sort of a translucent form, at least part of him. And then to my surprise, I see a woman next to him, which was a likeness, a young likeness of Julian's wife, who had passed away from COVID several months prior. She'd had many health issues and just didn't have the stamina to withstand COVID. And she was whispering in Lindsay's ear. And Lindsay conveyed that message to me. What I picked up was, and I said this to my host, Julian, I said, Kim is here. She's whispering in Lindsay's ear, and she said to tell you that she loves you and she misses you. I thought that was it had never happened to me before that way, but message from one to another. So I told Julian, and he just kind of shrugged. I knew that he didn't believe it. But you see, I think that he was having a lot of trouble with his grief, and he was not able to express it very well. He was closed down from these kinds of experiences, but his wife from the other side wanted him to know how much she loved and cared for him. So I wanted to give you that experience too. Okay, going on, let's talk about the mental plane communication, which is basically telepathic. This is the plane of our consciousness, which expresses our mental teachings, aesthetics, philosophies, our concept of conventional religions, cosmic consciousness, and the like. And the inner sound, which you may hear, is that of running water. And it reminds me of a little poem that I know, a short one that goes, all night long, the sound of the water says what I think. And it's very much like that. If you hear it, it's an inner sound, not an outer sound, though the outer sound can sometimes trigger inner sounds. So how is it here? Now, I've already described a couple of things. Like I said, it's kind of hard to categorize where your experiences might be, but this gives you a little bit of a clue. I have found that Lindsay comes to me in times when he wants to protect me. For example, driving home in really bad winter weather, I definitely felt his presence. And on the other hand, when I would think of him, I would see him in a cameo. He would be there in a flash. And let me describe this cameo. It's as if there's a sort of a kind of a circle of clouds, and in the middle, it graduates into light, intense light. And in the middle of it, I see a picture of his smiling, beautiful, young face. Every time I think of him, this vision appears to me in my inner screen. And so when I was thinking of Lindsay on his birthday, imagine what happens in the middle of the night. The doorbell rings. And I was visiting my brother, and it was in a neighborhood they're not remote, but they're on the edge of town, and they don't have much going on in the middle of the night. So I figured it was Lindsay. And then in the morning when I told him, he said, we didn't hear anything. You must have heard it. So these are examples of me communicating with him and him communicating with me because he wants to. And understand that this is happening mostly in the astral plane, though, although there's telepathy involved too, no speaking, just thoughts, words, feelings happening. Because it takes energy for the entity on the other side to rev down to communicate in the denser consciousness. That's what I'm trying to tell you here. The etheric plane, this is a very narrow barrier, they say, the travelers of the far country say, between the worlds of form and the upper worlds of light and sound, and inner light only. And it can sometimes be expressed by just a flash of light, sometimes by geometric forms, and sometimes otherwise. Now, this is very hard to pin down, but I will give you an example of what I think it's like, because the inner sound, they say, is like the buzzing of bees. Some time ago, this isn't part of my experience with Lindsay, but I want to illustrate this to you. I was traveling back from a business appointment and stopped in at an arboretum on the way home from out of town because I wanted to get my mother a plant for Mother's Day. At this arboretum, they had the plants all lined up beautifully on long tables underneath the shade of beautiful flowering Palo Verde trees, which had beautiful, beautiful golden flowers on them. And it must have been its peak. Everywhere were bees of all kinds. And as the wind blew the tree limbs, which were very floaty, they're very light limbs, the leaves of the flowers were falling down in cascades, beautiful golden cascades. And between the buzzing of the bees and the cascades of yellow flowers, I was enchanted. I got goosebumps. I felt a sense of joy and ecstasy momentarily that was really very special. And that's what I think it is kind of like when you are in that field between the world of form and the soul planes. This is the difference between the lower planes that have form. And as you go up from the physical to the etheric, it gets higher and finer and lighter until in the etheric area, it's just wispy. Then you enter into what's called the soul plane. We're all soul, folks, you know. And here is where the Akashic records are kept of light and sound and of the soul cycles that we have gone through. The Akashic records, the inner sound here is a single note of the flute. And this plane is often, in a sense, revved down so that we can understand it. You might experience it as pure light or pure sound, but sometimes you'll also see it as flying. If you have flying dreams, or you have dreams like I do, not only flying, but going up hills and down hills, of going up elevators or down elevators, of flying in an airplane and then coming down, chances are you're having an experience from the soul level. Okay, that's why I've depicted this. You might be going up a step into another world, all indicators. And here is an example of that cameo I was talking about, where the clouds open and you see something beyond, kind of like looking through a tunnel. I have two examples here, and then I'm going to close, just give you a glimpse of what else I could discuss if anyone is interested here, or maybe for another talk of some kind. But anyway, my experience here was of following Lindsay through a building. It was a maze, and he's walking very fast, and there's a group following him, and I'm trying to follow him too. We're going through this maze, and finally we come to like a mezzanine or something. There's an elevator. I see the group step on the elevator, the door closes, and away they go. And I get there, and I can't follow them. And in the dream, I am told, well, your pajamas or your gown is bogging you down. And that's why you couldn't keep up with them. And I interpreted that as the sheaths that I carry, my physical body, my emotional body, and so forth, they were already on a higher level, going up as a symbol of reaching into the higher dimensions, the higher states of consciousness. And so I could not follow at that time. It was not my time to do that. What is it like there? Well, they say that it's symphonic. It's the flute, it's the woodwinds, it's the violins, it's the humming of the violins in the symphony, it's deep humming, it's even the sound of the whirlwind like a tornado. And the light gets, as you go higher and higher, and there's always another step to take. You see the light, and this light would be too bright to see by our human senses, but it's finer and higher and lighter until all there is really is a light and sound of unconditional love. That's the love of the Creator. So with that, I'd like to close out for questions. I had prepared more, but I see the time is already almost 10 of the hour. And I'll just zip through this really, really quick to give you an idea of what's here. Maybe we'll save it. I had material on how we can hone in on our own quantum abilities to communicate with those on the other side of life. And this is through our pineal gland, which is our gateway, and our various chakras that we're working through. states of consciousness, all about our pineal gland, which is really kind of like a divine gateway. It's like a computer that allows us to receive, it's like a transistor, receive, store, and send messages, and we need to hone in on that and use it. The pineal gland is also known as the spiritual eye. And I explain how that goes and how some of the other cells within the brain are actually able to act like liquid crystals, like radio receivers and transmitters also, and how we can enhance our ability to be creatively receptive, to clear our mind, still the pool of the mind, to work like with heart math through the connection of our heart and our mind. And there are neurons that are like brain neurons in our hearts. So it's heart-mind math, really. How solitude helps us, how intentioning helps us, and also some modes, which others I'm sure here at the conference have talked about, yoga, different kinds of it, where it comes from, how to use it. I'm particularly interested in the sound current technology through using techniques such as hemisync and so forth. And creative visualization using not only mantras, but fixating on things like the 4D tesseract, what shall I say, lucid dreaming, what are you focusing on, remote viewing, hypnosis, regression, and so on. And I'm sorry I did not have time to go through this, but I'm happy to entertain any questions that you have. And if those of you are watching after the live performance here, you're welcome to send me a note and ask me a question.